Hey, this is the second part of a story that many people liked. You can listen to the first one using the hint above. Enjoy listening. She wasn't dead, but she was ready. It was July 12, 1979, and it was hot in the asylum. I remember every summer in that building because as soon as I turned the ovens on, the sweat poured out of my brow. I think the temperature was 98 that day. This always made the patients more anxious to come to the kitchen, and oftentimes some nurses would opt out, leaving me with a skeleton crew to cook. Since the kitchen obviously served a purpose in helping to feed the patients, I was running around trying to get everything ready. This wasn't much of an issue. I'm definitely used to rushing around, having worked in a professional kitchen before, but it was much easier to have some form of help. Today was an exception. There were 2 kitchens in the asylum. Mine, which was mostly for classes, but again served patients a better, more gourmet dinner, assuming it was cooked right. The other kitchen was much more generic. More of the patients went there because of diet restrictions, or they couldn't handle sitting down at an actual table like most of us do when we go to restaurants. From time to time, a major incident would happen in my kitchen, and it would shut it down for the day, and everyone would be served some sort of something they called potatoes, and a sorry excuse for a steak, which was more or less beef smashed together into a steak-looking slab. It was nasty, and I would just wait until I got home to eat. As hot as it was that day, I still had 10 patients working with me. We all worked fast and efficient, but one girl was not working, but rather arguing with another patient who just had depression. What she said freaked me out, mostly because I realized she was dead serious about what she was saying. "I can't believe you can see me." She had tears flowing from her eyes. "Why wouldn't I be able to?" He answered back, "I'm dead, Peter. I've been dead as long as I can remember. Look at my arms." She held out her arms. They looked fine to me. A nurse asked the girl to come with her and calm down. "Peter can see me too. I can't believe this. I must be the first ghost that people can see," she exclaimed with joy. "Remember we talked about this, Joyce. You aren't dead. You're sick in your head, and you just need to relax." The nurse tried to reassure the girl, but she would not have it. "I'm not fucking crazy. I am dead." She tore her shirt off and pointed to her stomach. "Do you see the hole? How can you not smell that?" "I smell disgusting." She screamed at the nurses, looking all around at the now silent room, until one of the other patients who had Down syndrome burst into tears. A nurse began to comfort him. The nurse took the girl by her hand and began to pull her away outside. The girl was still trying to prove to us all she was dead. This wasn't how we were supposed to act, and that was strange. Why didn't the nurse try to agree with her? I thought that is how we needed to act. Later that night, I decided to be nosy and looked into her cell. She was completely naked and looking down at herself, poking at her skin. What the doctors would do next was the most fucking despicable thing I have ever seen in my life. A week later from the day she had her meltdown, I saw her again in the class. This time she had open wounds in her arm. I told the nurses we couldn't let her cook like that. They understood but explained the doctors had given her open wounds hoping to snap her out of her psychosis. When she acknowledged that she had cuts, she would be dressed and medicated for them. I saw red. I'll admit I nearly grabbed one of the knives from the locked container and rushed down the halls to kill the doctors. I thought, today is the day you get fired, Bill. Here we go. I told the nurse to hold down the fort. I wasn't feeling good and ran down to her cell and looked up who her doctor was. Dr. T. Jones. Of course, one of the bad ones. I tried to be calm about it. I knocked on his door, and when he opened it and saw me and sighed and said, "Is this about Joyce?" I nodded and opened my mouth to say something, but a smirk went across that motherfucker's face, and I nearly punched his lights out. He held up a paper, still not opening the door fully. He had it with him. He knew I'd be coming. It was a paper signed by the head doctor and some official higher up in the government. I read it, and it literally said it was okay to experiment with actually cutting the girl open provided she was given pain medicine. They were thinking that if she actually had open wounds and looked dead, she would realize when they healed that she wasn't dead. "Don't worry, Bill, it's all in order." I handed it back to him and nodded. That isn't what I wanted to say, thought. I wanted to grab his throat and tear out his jugular with my hands. I wanted to scream at him and tell him if this was some sick joke to get back at me, then fine, but don't hurt the patients. She's finally happy that we can see her open gashes, Bill. I know how you like happy patients. I was shaking with anger, my fists clenched, and I literally bit my tongue and the sides of my mouth so hard I tasted blood. Finally, I said through clenched teeth, "You do what you need to do." I went back to the kitchen, the entire time planning out what I would do. For a moment, I wanted to release every patient and then kill every single fucking doctor. What good would that do, though? This is real life. Oftentimes we say we would go crazy if we were in this situation, but there was literally nothing that could be done that wouldn't stick me in jail. He had permission from someone higher up than the head doctor. Now that my friend had quit the head doctor position, the new head doctor was very stern with me. I had no leeway. When I got into the kitchen, what I saw scared my brain. The girl was standing on the counter screaming at the nurses to back away. I ran inside and saw she had a spoon in her hand. A wooden spoon, and she was jabbing herself in the stomach as hard as she could with it. "I just want to fucking die," she yelled. I could see her open wounds in her arms, leaking blood down all over all of the food. She cried, and I'm sure it hurt. I looked up at her and asked her what was wrong. "I'm dead, but I'm not dead. I want to disappear," she cried out. The nurses closed in on her and pulled her down off the counter, getting covered in blood. I took off my shirt and grabbed my undershirt, walking to the girl and covering her arms with it. "Joyce, have a doctor looking at your wounds. Why are you trying to convince all of them you're dead? They'll never believe you, so just tell them you know you're alive. What's the point in fighting?" The nurses looked at me like I was fucking mad, but Joyce saw the wisdom in what I was saying. She turned to the nurses and stopped resisting. Acknowledging her wounds meant they would be wrapped, and they would begin to think she was cured, because she saw the wounds as wounds and not as her decaying flesh. I saw her again the next day. The wounds were covered now. She gave me a quick wink and whispered, "It's working, Bill. They're leaving me alone." I patted her on the back, but still felt horrid. That doctor wasn't going to just stop there. He felt a superiority complex now. He wanted to screw around with very experimental drugs and experiments, and the last few years of me working, there were honestly the worst days of my career. How can you possibly think that cutting someone's arms would snap them out of a hallucination? I couldn't believe the doctor wasn't smart enough to know how to deal with the situation. Why not talk about it? Why do they have to medicate it? It's like burning someone alive who thinks they are burning alive to show them they aren't burning alive. It makes no fucking sense. To this day, when I think about it, I want to find that motherfucker and kill him, but it's not worth it. Plus, he died in a car accident in 1998 anyways. It's not over though. A few months later, she was beginning to talk about how she was dead. The hallucinations were too much for her. Seeing the cutting wasn't going to work, they resorted to more extreme measures, bringing her into the morgue and showing her dead people. They played videos and showed her pictures of the dead over and over. They gave her her very own book of the dead that she began to carry around with her. Would you believe she started to hallucinate about dead people? One day she looked around the kitchen and said something that made my heart stop inside of me. "Bill." I looked up and she was pointing in a corner. "Katrina is asking about you." My eyes widened and I stammered. The nurses all looked at each other, all feeling the same shiver go up their spines. The thought that Joyce wasn't hallucinating dead people, that she was seeing them, scared us. My mouth was dry, but I managed to get out. "Joyce, come back and let's start making food, okay?" She just kept staring into the corner. "But Katrina needs help. She's dead like me." I couldn't handle it anymore. This was too freaky and fucked up to let go on. I was terrified of Katrina and people knew not to mention her around me. I grabbed Joyce by the hand and shushed her. "Joyce, you can talk to Kair later. Right now we are cooking." Joyce never saw me act this way, let alone tug her and pulled her to the table. She never mentioned Katrina again, but I saw her looking into the corner all too often. And I knew she saw Katrina. God damn, it scares me to even think about it. Joyce was never cured. She got worse with her hallucinations until one day she cried that she was surrounded by dead people, and they wouldn't stop telling her how they died. She said she didn't want to hear them anymore. That night she strangled herself with her bed sheet, and on a piece of paper found in her room was the words, "I'm not dead, but I'm ready." Isolation therapy. I know some of the readers have told you that they were in an asylum or mental hospital. They've seen some of the horrors that can be done there. There's a reason I will refuse to go to an old folks' home. It's too reminiscent of the asylum, and I'll be damned if I ever become abused. I'm sure there are good ones, but I don't want to find out. The asylum I worked in was built to be confusing. Once you worked there long enough, you started to get used to the place, but the patients never did. They sometimes closed off exits for a few days, just to further confuse people. The basements were always horrifying. Dim-lit long corridors for storage, and the tunnels. My God, even back then I remember seeing shadow people walking down there. I've told you a lot of stories of the stuff I used to do to help the patients, how I used to be the chef there, and I cooked meals and had a cooking program. There were many times I was told to put things in food for some of the patients there. Times I had watched as some of them wither away or fall sick after eating some of my food. Look, some days I wanted to leave. Some days I would walk right up to the head doctor's office, raise my fist to knock on the door, only to turn and walk away. As much as I wanted to quit, I had to stay and advocate for these poor souls. Some of them would never be able to be saved, but there were a few who might look at my face and for a moment feel warm. And to me that was worth all the pain I felt being there. In the 60s and 70s, you could be tossed into an asylum for most any reason. Some troubled children would even be sent to the asylum instead of going to prison. The thought was that maybe they were just mentally ill, but the truth was the asylums knew that by accepting them it was more money. I remember seeing troubled girls and boys come in as frustrated teenagers who just needed love and acceptance from parents who gave them nothing, and they only left cold and empty. There was one young man named Joseph who was there because he was constantly secluded in his room smoking pot. His father said he never seemed to want to go outside or talk to anyone. He just wanted to smoke pot and stay in his room. He tried to take his drugs. He tried to take away his guitar. He tried to yell at him, but Joseph would find a way to get pot and would only go out when it was time for school. And even then his attendance was less than acceptable. I had a lot of questions. How did Joseph get pot if he never left his room to hang with friends? How did he got pot if he had no money? I watched Joseph on his first day in the kitchen. His hands were crossed around his chest, and he had the usual teenage look that told me he wasn't interested in this stupid thing, but he was just here because he had to be. I was gentle. I never asked him to do anything because I knew he wouldn't, but I kept an eye on him to find out what he would be interested in doing. After a few days went by, I noticed he started taking an interest in baking of all things. He finally opened up to me one day and said that his mother used to bake him a special cake on his birthday. Not store-bought, from scratch with homemade icing, made from cream cheese. When Mom died, Dad didn't cry even for a day. In a month he had a new girlfriend, and in 2 years he was married again. That's when the drinking started. I'm sorry, Joseph. I can't imagine how that must have felt. How old were you? I asked him. I could see in his eyes hurt and anger. I had found the issue. I had found what he was escaping from. Young. Too young. He said in a whisper. I knew he must not want to talk more about it, so I left it alone. I was scared for him. I knew what the asylum did to kids like him. He may open up to me, but he wouldn't open up to a doctor or nurse. They tended to treat them by humiliation and scolding. They might make them wear diapers and said they were acting like a baby, so they would treat them like one, making them walk around in the things for all to see. Some weren't allowed to go outside. For Joseph, I saw him for a while, and then he was gone. They decided that if he liked staying inside and smoking pot, they would put him in a dark room with food and water and nothing else. No window, no books or games, just what he was given for food every day. No one was allowed to speak to him. They figured if he spent so much time without people, he would soon learn to love talking to people. This literally broke him. After a week in this room, he came back completely changed. Instead of wanting to speak to everyone, though, he wouldn't speak at all. It was as if he forgot words. You might think that they realized the experiment did nothing, and they should try something different, not the asylum. Instead, they put him back in the room for another week. It was at night when they did it. I was heading home when I heard him screaming at the top of his lungs, screaming for them to put him down, screaming that he would behave. I turned a corner and saw him being carried by 5 doctors as they shoved him into a straitjacket and tossed him into the room. His screams didn't stop, though. As they shut the door, the screams continued, although muffled. I walked away for the night with my head down. There was nothing I could do for him. The next day, when I went back and I walked by the isolated cell they tossed him in, I couldn't look in a window like the other cells, but I just listened and could hear muffled cries. I shook my head and went to the kitchen, praying that maybe they would let him out early. Once was bad enough, but to go back and know how horrible the week was going to be, it must have driven him insane. The next day I walked by and heard that he was talking to himself. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but that afternoon he was gone. I had thought the worst, but a nurse had said he was removed because he was ramming his head against the wall and had knocked himself out cold. In a few days he was back in the class. He was truly broken and half insane now. "Hello, Bill. How are you today?" he said, robotic and politely. I could see his eyebrows now had a twitch to them. "I'm good, Joseph. Glad to see you are back," I responded. "I am well. Thank you, Bill. I hope today we will bake." "I love to bake." His response was quick and out of tune. It lacked personality of any sort. "Yes, there will be some baking today." I smiled warmly. "I am glad. They say that I have improved, and if I continue to improve, they will let me return home. I am glad to be going home. I miss my father. I love him. I also love my doctor. I'm thankful that they treated me. Since I am better, I can go home soon, they say." The repetition scared me. I started to worry that he was truly broken for good and may never recover. I saw his eyes and realized they were dilated. They had put him on some form of medication. His nurse broke in the middle of his long circular monologue by saying, "Come on, Joseph, let's go bake then." "Okay, I do love baking. Mother, bake for me. I will be happy to go back home and bake for my father. The doctors say I can go home soon if I continue to recover." He was pulled away by the nurse, his eyebrows twitching like they had a mind of their own. I was completely crushed by this. How could they do this to a boy who was merely stressed with his home life? They never tried to talk to him. They'd never let him open up to them. His father had failed him, and his mother was dead. Instead, they treated the problem like an issue that could just be solved with medication or a therapy. They called it isolation therapy, as if it was some real cure. This story doesn't end in some cruel, bloody way. It ends with Joseph going home. He smiled as he left with his father. He repeated how happy he was to go home, and I think his father would have been taken aback by his behavior if he wasn't slightly drunk himself. Whatever medication Joseph was on, I'm sure they kept him on it. I had hoped that Joseph had gotten off of it and recovered, but sadly 2 months later he had made a noose and killed himself. I'd like to say how sad I am that Joseph had done this to himself, but truthfully I think he was tired of putting up a front and knew if he went back to pot and seclusion they'd toss him back in a cell. To him, the only escape was a rope. I wish I could have done something to help him, but there was again nothing that could be done. Tons of teenagers came in and were treated as poorly as Joseph. A majority of them had broken homes, and the asylum was just the place they were tossed to get them away from home. The excuses ranged from sexual promiscuity to drug abuse to the ambiguous term, unusual behavior. They were all tossed in like orphans and treated as lab rats. To Joseph, I truly hope you are in a better place. I hope that you found your mother in heaven and you are in her arms once more. I hope, if nothing else, you are truly resting in peace. Through the window pane glass. It was always sad for me to see the older people living in the asylum, ones that had been there since the truly bad days. Most were quiet and stared out windows, never uttering a sound. We called them the walking dead. Truly, I think deep inside, if anything was left of their brains, they just wanted to die. They had no family that cared, and they were just left here until they did eventually rot. Bertha was one of the older women who was classified as a walking dead, but really was just quiet. She would sit outside of her room in her wheelchair and watch. She kept it all in her head and was fearful of nothing. I always wondered why she was there. I would walk by and she would follow me with her eyes. I would give a gentle hello and she wouldn't respond, only continued to stare until I was out of sight. One day I decided to try to have a conversation with her. I started simple. "How are you doing today, Bertha?" I asked. She looked up at me, and there was a silence for a good while until she finally spoke up. "Terrible." She turned her head away quickly to the side. I took it as a sign I probably should just leave her alone. But of course, me being me, I couldn't. "I'm sorry to hear that. Is there anything I can help you with?" Hearing this, she chuckled a bit and looked back at me. "Sure. Go find my husband and put a bullet in his brain." I was taken aback by this comment. Honestly, it scared me, because the look in her eye when she said it made me realize she was dead serious. "What did he do?" I asked, half fearing the answer but half wanting to know. "He didn't like me much after I had our second child. I was getting old and ornery," he said. "He told me that I was getting crazy, and he loved me too much to let me stay this way. So he sent me to this place so I could be hidden away. I'm sure he's with a younger, more attractive woman, and the kids think I'm some lunatic they can't visit. I just want to see my children once. Is that too much to ask?" Then she burst into tears and covered her face. All I could think was how awful her story was. I wasn't sure what the husband's side was, and one thing I learned in the asylum was not to generalize. Some of the patients were incredible liars, and if you believed all of them, you'd end up very confused. "I'm sorry. I wish I could help you, but I can't kill people. Maybe I can find your children." She smiled with delight. She told me their names, Gerald and Katrina, and if I could find them, she would be so happy to finally see them again. That night I looked in the phone book for the names. Sure enough, I found one of them was still living in the area, so I phoned him. "Hello. Yes, is this Gerald?" "Yes, it is. Who am I speaking with?" The voice asked, a bit cautious of a telemarketer. "Hi, I'm Bill, and I work for the asylum your mother is at, and I just wanted to inform you she wishes to see you. And if you were comfortable coming to the asylum, she would appreciate the visit." There was silence on the other side. Then I heard some whispering before Gerald finally came back to the phone. "Bill, I'm sorry to waste your time, but our mother is in the asylum because she is not well. I wanted to reason with him, but I knew it wouldn't be successful." "That's fine. I just wanted to give you and your sister the opportunity to see her." There was some more silence before he said, "I don't have a sister." He sounded hurried now. Then he continued, "Bill, my mother was diagnosed with having delusions. She attempted to kill my father because she said he was stealing bubblegum from her brother's store. She's insane. Please keep yourself safe and stay away from her. Thank you for your concern in the call. However, I will not see my mother. Your call has confirmed she is far too insane to have a genuine conversation with." Then he hung up. I was left with a mixed bag of feelings. What could I tell her, and who should I believe? I knew she could be dangerous, but I wasn't sure how bad she was. The next day when I went in, I saw her in the hall, and when she saw me, she had so much joy on her face. "Oh, Bill, did you talk with my children? Did you talk to my Gerald and my Katrina?" My face went sad. "Mrs. Bertha, your children are very busy people, and they wanted you to know they think of you, but can't come at this time." I was trying to let her down easy, but I saw over her face a look of sadness and anger. Depression hurts. Who hasn't at one time or another been a little depressed? It was one of the most common issues in the asylum. Looking back, I have no idea how anyone thought shoving a person into a cell was going to somehow make them happier. but I guess it probably prevented them from committing suicide. Well, most of the time. When someone wants to kill themselves, they're going to do it. The strangest part to me is when depression makes you take another person's life along with your own, as if you could bring them with you or prevent them from suffering too. It was a Tuesday in July, hot and sticky, and with the ovens running, the kitchen was extraordinarily hot. I wiped the sweat off my head with my sleeve, as if that was going to somehow make it cooler. The windows in the sunlit room were already open, and we had 3 fans blowing air around just to get a breeze. The kitchen was also full of patients, all sweaty, and most of whom didn't want to be there, even if they couldn't communicate it. We were in the process of making fresh summer lunches. Cucumber salad, potato salad, stuff that I could toss in the cooler, and that would serve as a nice way to cool off in the heat when lunchtime came. Meanwhile, I was baking some pastries that could be cooled or frozen. The heat was unbearable, and I knew I was losing control of the patients. "Can we please turn the ovens off?" one of them said. Then the room erupted in protests against the heat. I lost control. "You all know I can't do that. I'll grab some cold food for us to eat." One of the patients got up and began to walk over to the oven to turn it off. A nurse grabbed him. "No," she hissed at him. I always hated when nurses treated patients like children. The man looked like he was in his mid-20s. He was brown of hair with green eyes. He was just here for depression and anxiety issues. "Please, I can't take it." I could see he was crushed on the inside, but he was trying to keep composure. Meanwhile, the room was responding by others getting up to try to turn off the oven. "All right, listen." I raised my voice. "Anyone who is too hot, why don't you just go back to your rooms, and the rest of us will do." I was ready to lose my entire workforce, but at least I would get some work done. Nearly all of the patients got up and left, leaving me with a few who couldn't communicate, and that one man with the nurse, now in a heated argument over him leaving. "Do you want me to tell Dr. Hervit about the thing I caught you doing?" she barked at him. I tried to ignore it, but my ears eavesdropped. I couldn't imagine that the guy was in any way, shape, or form needing supervision other than to make sure he didn't kill himself. That didn't warrant the nurse treating him like a child, though. Depressed people need allies, not parents. "Fine. Just." A big sigh came out of the man. I looked over and saw him go back to his station and work. Something was hidden in that look, beyond the humiliation that just happened. The way that nurse looked at him was everything but natural. I saw him look up at me, then immediately to the floor. He was terrified of the staff here, especially his nurse. I wanted to ask him what she had done to him, but I knew that would do no good, because he would never tell. As I was leaving for the day, I decided to go out and walk by his room to check on him and see if there was anything I could learn. I always felt like I could help these guys somehow. I hear hushed whispers as I got close. I walked past and shot a quick glance, but found the window covered with something. Curiosity got the better of me, and I tried to hear what was happening. "You're not. Little pest. You're mine. Unless you want," was all I could hear. My heart jumped as I recognized that it was the nurse. If I could only see behind whatever was covering the door. "You're mine." I thought, that kind of possessiveness makes me think. No, I didn't want to consider what kind of horrible things the nurse might be doing to the man. She couldn't be sexual abusing him, but I knew now she was abusing him. The question was how to get evidence. I decided to walk in a circle around the area. and see what I could see on my second time around. When I came back around, I saw the nurse leaving. Her hair was ruffled a bit, and she was straightening herself. No, I couldn't believe it. There was no way a female nurse would do that. But evil knows no gender. I had no evidence, though, so I was just drawing conclusions. Either way, I decided to confront her. "Vicky." I called out, walking to her. She jumped a bit, and I could see her face get flushed. She wasn't ugly, but she wasn't attractive either. She looked in her 40s, but I had no knowledge of her age. "Bill, shouldn't you be off?" she asked, puzzled. But I could see she already knew what I was about to say. "Listen, I think you were harsh with Mike today. I don't want to tell you how to do your job, but I think humiliation isn't a good way to help someone with depression," I said as calm as I could. I saw her face turn sour with anger. "I would stay out of this one, Bill. If you knew who he was and what he did, you'd think twice." She turned to walk away, but I stopped her with a gentle hand. "Whatever he did, it makes no difference to me. He's here, not in jail, so he should be treated with respect and kindness. How is he going to recover if you humiliate him?" I asked honestly. Recover? Doubtful. That one's a lost cause, Bill. Just leave us be." She hissed at me again. Something was definitely going on, and I knew it now. "Leave us be," I thought as she pushed past me and walked down the hall. I looked in the room to see the man curled up on the floor and heard the soft sounds of tears. His room was completely bland. No blankets or anything he could use to kill himself. I looked to my left and saw the nurse staring at me. Vincent, in all my years there, I was never more afraid of someone from the staff as I was in that moment. She looked like she wanted to find any object to murder me with. I think the only thing that stopped her is knowing that she would end up in the asylum. And that fear outweighed the thought of me catching her. She waited for me to start walking away before she also left. I wasn't sure what to do. I knew she was abusing him. But oftentimes no one did anything about abuse from nurses unless there were bruises. No one in their right mind would even listen if I brought up the potential of sexual abuse. But I knew if I didn't act, that young man would not be able to leave the asylum until he was old. He should have been furthering his career, not in an asylum. The next morning I left early and immediately went to his room. The window was covered. When I put my ear to the door, I heard nothing. She got here that early. I whispered to myself, annoyed that the nurse had beat me to it. I stormed off, not wanting to walk in. When the nurse and Mike didn't show up to another hot class, I was taken aback. I asked if anyone had seen them. The other nurses said no. I decided to walk down the hallway and check on his room. The window was still covered. As I reached for the door handle, felt a total sense of dread. I was tossing back and forth whether or not I should open the door or call security. My hand shook as I turned the handle and opened the door to a pungent smell of death. Blood covered the room, and I saw the nurse naked, bleeding out of her bits. I saw her jaw fully ripped open, and both her eyes bleeding out, and it looked like they had been crushed. I slammed the door shut. I had not seen the man. Staggering, I made it across the hall and pressed the security call button. And within seconds, a security guard had come. "It's bad." I pointed at the door. He shot me a look and quickly opened the door with his gun braced against his arm. I saw the man now, his face in the toilet, which was impossible to drown in. He had bashed his face against it so many times he had fractured his skull. Now nurses who had walked by were looking in. The security guard grabbed the man, turning him out of the toilet. His face was broken, but we looked at each other, shocked to find he was still alive. Above his bed on the wall, he had written in blood, "Death has to be better than this." On the record, it was written that Mike had raped and killed his nurse and would have to be transferred to a new hospital where he would be treated as fully psychotic. But I have a different theory. I think she had made him perform for her, and he decided it was enough and bit her, fully ripping off bits of her, then went to her throat, and when she struggled her, beat her face in breaking her jaw before he finally succeeded. Then he was on to kill himself. Whatever the case, no one would have believed me. Had the man hung on a few more days or weeks, maybe I could have helped him. Depression doesn't give you time, though. It slowly suffocates you until you have no choice but to ask in desperation. You forget the sun rises in the morning and are covered in what seems like eternal darkness. Hopefully, Mike found peace, but sadly, psychosis has never been treated with kindness. I can't begin to tell you how often I have nightmares of the asylum. You know, to be honest, I don't think I've ever had a good dream of the place. It's not that I didn't ever have fun or enjoy the work, but the stress and the things I saw outweighed any of the good memories. Vincent, as I've told these stories more and more, I've brought up so many bad thoughts that I haven't thought of in a long time. That's why I couldn't talk about it for a while, but I realized I needed to speak out, to tell my experiences, because it gives those people a voice. Imagine being in a straitjacket, behind a locked door with the only small window in it. Imagine being pulled away every day to get shock or hydrotherapy. Those were the lucky ones. When the pill craze really took off, some of those poor patients became human rats. If you were a homeless nobody, you would be subjected to the most far-out drugs. These were the silent people. When they died, we didn't say anything about it. No one questioned their deaths. No one tried to sue. No one really cared. I remember one woman in the late 60s who came in distraught. She was an Asian woman about 4 feet 10 inches tall. She had short black hair and was, we will say, pleasantly plump. She was wheeled in with a straitjacket on. She smelled horrible and had ratty clothes on. She screamed in some language I didn't understand and kept calling out, "A bodzi, a bodzi." I wasn't sure what it meant, but I remember her face and the way she thrashed in the wheelchair. After about a week in what they call observation, they decided on some treatment of some sort that sedated her pretty good. She was able to start talking in English again, and they put her in the kitchen with me and the others to help her recover. I actually really liked her and soon realized she was a good cook. Her story was really odd, though. I'm not sure if she was delusional or just had her time wrong. She kept talking about her father, and with a heavy accent, and in broken English she would tell me, "My father and mother got shot in the 40s. They said they Japanese. Father said no. We know Japanese, but they shot him. They took me away." It was heartbreaking, and every day she told me the same story. I thought at first maybe her parents were taken into the internment camps, but given her thick accent, I wasn't sure if she was born in America. It was quite a mystery to me, but after a month of the same story, I would always look at her with sympathetic eyes and tell her I was sorry for her loss. One day she told me another story. When I heard the different story, I was honestly shocked, but also really excited to see it, because maybe she had remembered something new and was improving. Maybe she could recover and get out of here alive. I know that sounds dramatic, and I don't mean it to, but frankly, most homeless people that were like her didn't make it out. They just stayed there until an experiment killed them, or they died of natural causes. Usually that meant a heart attack, kidney failure, or liver failure, all results of heavy medication use. Anyways, she told me about her husband, saying, "I had a husband. He was big man. He loved me, but I couldn't give him children. She trailed off in some different language again. It was as if she remembered some bad thought, and it began to stress her out. Finally, my curiosity got the better of me, and I asked about her. I was told she had tried to knife someone in the street, and when caught had no record besides a birth certificate and a SSN. It was odd. An immigrant from Korea wouldn't have a birth certificate from America. I was really confused now. How did she have such a strong accent and broken English, but have been born here? Seeing the improvement, the doctors were all excited, and they wanted to put her on some drugs to help her recover. They said she didn't need to be so sedated, and it would help her remember her past better. After hearing her talk about her husband, I started to wonder if maybe her remembering was a good idea. Who knows why she was on the street? And some good old-fashioned therapy might have been the best solution rather than drugs to see what she would do when recovered. The doctors typically warned us that the patient was trying a drug that could bring unexpected results. We all knew this meant an experimental drug, and all of us would be on edge and ready if the patient did anything, well, crazy. I didn't notice anything horrible with her at first. She just became much quieter. Then the next week, she didn't want to cook anymore, so they took her out of the class. Strangely enough, the week after that, she came back and was more talkative than ever. Her thick accent still there. She was talking in full Korean and rarely in English. Of course, like the curious, crazy person I am, I went to her room to peek at her files and see what the hell the doctors were up to this time. I looked in to find her drawing with her finger on the wall. She didn't have ink or anything, she was just tracing the wall. I looked into her file as quickly as I could and saw a stack of papers. The top page went something like, "Experimental drug no. 3. Patient responding oddly. Reverting back to native tongue and sporadic. Talking often almost manic. Sores on her arms getting worse. Possible stomach ulcers. Keeping patient under observation for blood in vomit or stool. No kidney damage reported. Through increased urination present. Possibly due to increased water intake due to dry mouth." A door closed, making me jump, and I shut the file and shoved it back in its place and walked off. I began to think on what I had just read. Of course they had her on some experimental drug, but stomach ulcers and sores. She was under observation to see what the drugs would do to her. They didn't really care so much about her. They more cared about finding a good drug. My biggest question was what the other 2 drugs had done to her. The next week, she stopped coming to the class again. I would have asked why, but when I walked by her room, all I could hear was screaming. Not your normal scream, but a blood-curdling scream as if someone was stabbing her. Those happened, but were few and far between. Maybe once in a blue moon that someone would scream like that. For her, it was constant. It only lasted a day as her voice got hoarse, and her screams turned to soft whimpering and cries. I was honestly heartbroken at this point, but as always, you have to ask yourself if it's worth losing your job trying to help someone whom no one cares about. These types of moral decisions are what still haunt me today. I started looking into her room after the screaming. They seemed to try a new medication each week, and by the 5th week you could see she was starting to react in a horrifying way. She went from pleasantly plump to real thin. Sores covered her body from head to toe. and all she seemed to do was sit in a corner crying and whimpering, rocking back and forth. Once I saw a nurse try to bring her for a walk, and she screamed at her, trying to claw her with her fingers. She started to look like Ghoul at this point, and it was heartbreaking. The 6th week, she was put into a straitjacket after chewing her nails into a point and trying to escape by gouging the eyes of a nurse out. She succeeded in clawing the woman's face to pieces, then running out, but didn't get far. They cut her nails so short they bled, or maybe it was because she was struggling so hard. It's tough to say with how they treated her. Finally, the thing that really hit me was on the 7th week. I saw her look at me. She was pale as a ghost, and her face was as bony as a skeleton. I was filled with rage, but what could I do? She was a nobody. Vets could be advocated for, because they were former warriors and there were programs. But a homeless woman with no record, no one cared. Her body rose, but she was hunched over, grasping her stomach. Her dress had dried vomit and blood on it. She put a hand on the window as if trying to reach out to me. She was slow like a zombie. I put my hand against the glass where hers was in mouth. "I'm so sorry." Tears filled my eyes, but I saw in hers comfort. Not a comfort like she was happy someone cared about her, but a comfort as if she was relieved. I would realize why later. I let her see me cry. I wanted her to know. Then her hand fell, and she went back to her bed, and I walked away. I went home, and all weekend I was thinking about her. She haunted my dreams each night, and I knew I had to at least see if there was something I could do, or maybe they were going to pull her from the drugs. When I came in Monday morning, I went in early so I could really snoop at her files. Experimental drug no. 7. Loss of weight continuing. Stomach ulcers increased. This damn drug is working, but it's killing her. Switching doses not possible. Going back to the drawing board. Sores have increased. Experimental drug no. 8. This is useless. Sure, it works, but at the cost of a person's life, is it worth it? She won't even eat anymore. If no improvement by end of week, we'll switch to generic drug. Hope she recovers. I shut the folder, thrusting it back in the file holder. Hope she recovers. What the honest hell? I looked in to see her laying on the floor, not in her bed. I sighed a deep sigh, and I went to the kitchen, preparing the dishes for the day. With every chop, a little aggression came out. Something inside me told me the poor woman was dead. Before the class started, I took a walk around the place and went by her room. A man was cleaning it, and she was gone. One glance to the file holder told me it was empty. You might ask me what happened. Honestly, I have no idea. I went to a nurse and asked what happened, and I was just given the old. She died from complications. It was bullshit, and I knew it, but what could I do? Tell them all I saw the files, and they were all disgusting. Who knows what kind of shit I'd get myself into admitting something like that. I was probably the last person to talk to her like a human. Maybe she was holding on hope, but when she saw the hopelessness in my eyes, she gave up. I guess I shouldn't blame myself, but how can you help someone who is a nobody? I never knew anything about her, and what I did learn could have been a delusions she had. Some days I still think about what her story really was. I'll never know, but what haunts me is the look she had. She was comforted seeing me cry for her. I think she knew that when she died, at least someone would mourn for her. Maybe that brought her comfort, knowing that someone actually gave a damn about her. Medications for your brain are just a cocktail of chemicals. Doctors kind of know what it's doing, but it's mostly theory. You mix up the chemicals and hope it does its job. If it doesn't, you up the doses or try a different cocktail. There is no magic cure, only guesswork. Human experiments like these may have given us some of the nice medications we have today, but sacrifices have been made to get here. There are a few other stories I'll have to tell about human experiments, ones that are much more gruesome.